And we know that many parents, particularly white parents, may not have the tools for talking about racism and for taking action. So my first question to you, Beth, is why do you think whites have a hard time talking about race? And what happens when we don't talk about it?
Thank you, Yves-Rose. I'm going to do the second question first. What happens when we don't talk about it? Mm-hmm. And I think that the answer is that things don't change. I was on a webinar last night hosted by Showing Up for Racial Justice, which is an organization that some of you might know or be interested in checking out. And one of the people said very succinctly, whites are the ones that block change on racial issues. So when we don't talk about it, nothing changes. And then why do we have trouble talking about it? I want to lean heavily on the work of Robin DiAngelo, who has written a book called White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. And just in a nutshell, some of the insights that she shares. So first she describes white fragility. This might be a concept people are familiar with or not, but she defines it as a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. Mm-hmm. So I think one way to answer the question, why do we have such a hard time, is that we've got this thing called white fragility, right? That causes us to, even, any time that racial issues get mentioned, we have a range of emotional responses and make defensive moves that change the subject from race to our emotions. And I'll just say two more quick things about this idea of white fragility. What she talks about, what causes it, is that frankly, we don't have practice as white people in talking about race. Most whites live in really segregated spaces where race is not discussed, and we're taught misinformation about race. In particular, we're taught that racism is only about horrible actions by horrible individuals, and that the United States is fundamentally a just place. So when things are brought up that suggest that we are perpetuating racism or white supremacy, it's deeply threatening to a lot of white people, to most of us, to our sense of ourselves as good people, to our belief that our accomplishments are the result of merit and our hard work, as opposed to the system is rigged in our favor, and it deeply threatens our worldview. So so what do? We go quiet, we cry, we become defensive, we get angry, we do all of these things that shift the attention from the conversation to our emotions.
And I would like to build upon the point that Beth made about this desire to be good people, right? I think we all as humans have this desire to be good people, and that actually gets in the way of white folks engaging in conversations around race and racism. Our need to be good people actually stops us from being better people. And that might sound counterintuitive. So how might that be? I think a part of, to Beth's point, white fragility is also understanding parts of white dominant culture that leads to this. And the aspect of that is this false dichotomy, right? Either I'm good or I'm bad. Either I'm racist or I'm not racist. And so when we approach the world through that lens of either or, it's really difficult to go anywhere. There is nowhere to go. And when there's nowhere to go, to Beth's point, we either fight, like I want to protect my identity because I am not racist. So how could I be perpetuating racial bias? Or we freeze, right? Our body is in place, but our hearts and our minds are checked out of the conversation. Or we flight, we ignore or we avoid and we deflect the conversation. So when we have this either or thinking, the only alternative, there's only one, is to do one of those three things. And the work that I want to talk about is a book by Dolly Chugg, and she talks about how do people be the person you mean to be, how do good people fight bias. And she talks about this idea of being a good-ish person, because being a good-ish person allows room for growth rather than condemnation. It allows room for us to consciously and actively think about the ways that we might be perpetuating racial bias and interrogate that, challenge those views, and then navigate around that. So one thing I think for aspiring allies and accomplices who aspire to be anti-racist, because of the system we're socialized in, it will always be an aspiration until we start to really change the system, is to reframe the question. I don't think the question should be, am I racist? Am I non-racist? Am I anti-racist? I think the question is actually, to what extent is racism playing out in this situation? And at what level? Is it an individual level? Is it my consciousness, what I believe, what I'm bringing to the table? Is it an interpersonal level, how I am interacting with colleagues, friends, and students of color? Is it an institutional level? What are the practices and policies at the organizational level in which I work and of which I'm a part? Or is it at a systemic level, which we'll talk a bit about in a few? And I think reframing the questions that way allows us to understand that 100% of our experiences are impacted by race. And there is no way around that because of the system that we are socialized. And then when we think about that, we allow ourselves, I think, as folks who are aspiring to be allies and accomplices in this work with the Black community and other communities of color, it allows you to make mistakes, take accountability, and get better at it. The more you do it, the better you get at it. The better you get at it, the more you do it. So it's a new cycle that you're entering into. And one of the things, if you haven't seen Verna Myers' TED Talk on how to overcome bias, and she talks about this concept of walking boldly towards them and facing them head on. One of the things that she says in that talk that really resonates with me is, stop trying to be good people, be real people.
Oh, thank you. That was a lot, and a lot of good comments in the chat room as well. Wanting to know the name of the books you both mentioned. And let me just remind or tell our listeners right now, all the books and all the resources will be available. If actually they are already available on our website, many of them, and we'll add others that is mentioned in the chat room. We'll put all of them up for you on the Agnes Scott Diversity website, and they'll be up by this afternoon. So thank you, both of you. That was an amazing opening. Lots to talk about, especially when we talk about room for growth. You know, I think that requires us to be aware. But the messages of white supremacy are like a smog that we all breathe in, unrelated to our intention, our awareness, or agreement about how good we are. So how can we use this awareness and this room for growth and this yearning for learning to change our thinking about racism? How might this awareness impact white fragility that you talked about, Beth?
Right, so a lot in that question. The a term that gets used to describe the effect of this smog that you're talking about, that we all move through, the smog of white supremacy, and the message that we get is implicit bias, right? And so there's one of the resources that we're going to post is the Implicit project at Harvard University, where they've been studying implicit bias for years. But I think one of the main thing, or a main thing, I think, to take away from recognizing that we are all socialized in this smog is that, of course, we all hold racially biased views. I remember hearing Cornel West, who's an African-American philosopher, speak when I was in graduate school. And he was speaking not only to the white people in the audience here too, because there's also internalized racism that results from walking around in this smog. So one of the key things that it can do in terms of our change of thinking about racism is that racism is not just out there, it's deep in us, and we've got to confront that. And then the other piece is that I think it's possible that it could help in terms of one of the classic deflective moves, defensive moves that D'Angelo talks about under the rubric of white fragility, is to just get really, really defensive, and that coming out in various different ways. But if you think of, if we can shift our thinking from, oh, I'm going to be shocked if it's pointed out to me that I'm doing something racist, or that I'm doing something as a white person, or I'm surprised by that, I'm shocked by that, rather than if it's, no, of course I am doing things that perpetuate white supremacy. Of course I do. This is the smog I'm in. Now what do? I need to step up and take responsibility for that. And so rather than it being threatening, if someone points that out to me, it's a gift if I'm committed to racial justice.
Taking responsibility. That's also a lot to talk about there as well. And these responsibilities really are within a structure, right? I mean, it's not just responsibility for this one event that happened recently, or some series of events. It's like, it's a big structure and system issue. And so Jacinta, professor and scholars Kaunari writes, quotes, racism is a structure, not an event. Can you elaborate on this idea for us?
Of course. I think that it's a very complex topic, so I'll try my best to do it in a succinct and concise way. I think too often we view racism through the individual lens. It's important for us to think about how do we transform our own consciousness, but we also cannot ignore the policies, the history in which we live in, the culture, and many other factors that have gotten us here today. And there are reasons behind that. When we think about like the protests that are happening right now, yes, people are protesting the murder of George Floyd, of Ahmaud Arbery, of Breonna Taylor, and so many other Black people at the hands of police and white citizens who demonstrate racism towards those people. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Really what people are protesting is everything beneath the iceberg. 401 years of history that is the foundation of white supremacy. And these complex systems that we are socialized in, as Beth mentioned, that develop, maintain, and actually protect racism. And that's what folks in the street are saying, is that enough is enough. This is not just the tip of the iceberg and these cruel actions by a group of bad police officers. This is a broader system that we need to think about. And in structural racism, there are three specific and distinct components that blend together and intertwine and intersect to get to where we are today. And those three components are public policies. What are our laws and how are they implemented by our government, our public institutions, and private institutions? The second is institutional practices. What are the organizational practices of multiple institutions within our society, such as the criminal justice system, such as education and the housing market? And then finally, cultural misrepresentation. What are the perspectives and the stereotypes that are constantly portrayed about the Black community that in this small we have all internalized, maybe not consciously, but unconsciously, and how does that show up in our behavior and in our thinking? And I think what's important is that we have to address both of these things jointly. We have to address, right, individual interpersonal racism, but we also have to address this structural piece. William Faulkner wrote, and it's a quote that I want to read verbatim. He said, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." The past is never dead, it's not even past. And to ignore the last 401 years of history is egregious, right? From slavery to Jim Crow, to racial covenants, to redlining, to our freeway construction, even in the city of Atlanta. You check out the 1619 project, there is a piece in there specifically around why our traffic is so horrible today. But it was because of public policy and institutional practices and cultural misrepresentation that happened 60 years ago, and we're feeling the impact of that today. So check that article out, it's really interesting about the city of Atlanta and transportation. So from my opinion, individual racism, anti-Blackness, and prejudice is a result of structural racism and not the cause of that. And because of that, we have to come up to the systemic level and really focus on that right now. The dialogue is really focused on well, the individual racism level dominates the conversation. We have to switch it around. And there's another quote that I want to read. I love Bell Hooks. She is one of my favorite authors. And in Killing Rage, Ending Racism, she says there must exist a paradigm, a practical model for social change that includes an understanding of transforming consciousness that are linked to efforts to transform structures. We can transform our consciousness as much as we want. We can interrogate our own levels of racism, of internalized racism, but if we do not focus on structures and systems, it will not change. And one thing that I say a lot is that the system is self-supporting, so it doesn't need our active support. It will happen whether we support it or not, but to change it, it does need our active resistance.
This is a very complex topic indeed. You know, I've heard many terms being talked about today so far: implicit bias, white fragility, structural racism, individual racial bigotry. It's a lot, and it's amazing. I worry sometimes that a lot of people out there, for some people, this might be the first time they are having this conversation about racism and how to be anti-racist. So I think at this moment, I am compelled, I want to play a very short, 2 minutes, very short, but I need all the listeners and viewers' attention to the screen because you have to actually see it if you are listening. A very short video. We'll stop, we will not play the whole video, but we'll stop at the right moment. And so please go ahead, we can play.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire Black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny Black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, Black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home value.
So we wanted to stop the video here because there's only 2 more minutes and it is available on YouTube if you want to finish it at some point. And we've put it in the chat room. But the reason we played this is that I think it's the panelists have talked about all of these issues, and I wanted to provide that summary of it because it is truly about structural racism that has been around for hundreds of years, as both our panelists have said. And redlining is still happening. I mean, it's so, I hope you find this video helpful, but I want to get back to our fabulous panelists. But first, I want to turn to our audience for a minute. I want to encourage you to answer this question in the chat room. And remember, The chat room is not anonymous. But if you're white and you're watching, and what are the biggest obstacles you face to talking about race and racism? We talked in the beginning of the top of the podcast. Beth talked about that a little bit, but we want to hear, what are your challenges? What are the biggest obstacles you face when talking about race and racism? And for everyone who's on the who's watching and listening right now, what are your hopes for dismantling racism in your community? So we want to hear from you. Go ahead in the chat room and type away. As you were typing, I'll come back and read a few of them a few minutes, but let me turn back to Beth. You are a professor. What is one skill for dismantling racism that you teach your students that you can share with the audience?
Okay.
Or maybe more than one, Beth.
No, just one. I just want to do one. This was real. It was really hard to decide what to talk about when you showed me these questions earlier when I was preparing. But what I decided to talk about, I wanted to put another what I think is central concept out there and skill that people can think about developing, and that's the ability to bring an intersectional lens to your understanding of situations. And so intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who's an African-American legal scholar. But it captures a phenomenon that especially anti-racist Black feminists have been talking about for years, which is the way that different axes of dominance and subordination co-constitute each other and support each other. And so the idea being that trying to address axes of oppression in isolation doesn't work. So I can just give a simple example of what I'm talking about here. So there's this, one of the ways that implicit bias plays out. Now we know what implicit bias is. Now that how that plays out is in the adultification of Black children. So Black children are frequently read as older than they are, and this often leads to tragedy and horrible treatment of Black children because they're being held to the standards of adults, or they're being read as adults. So adultification is the word. So so that's something that we need to figure out how to address. If we don't include a gender analysis in there, our understanding of the situation and our interventions are going to be inadequate. And what I mean by that is this, that the way that adultification of little Black boys tends to play out is little Black boys as being read as threatening, right? Physically threatening often. Little Black girls are often read as sexually provocative. And you can imagine what follows from that. So so this is the sort of situation where if we're going to deal with the racist implications of implicit bias, we've got to also be paying attention to gender, right? So that's just one example, but that kind of more nuanced thinking about issues of race. Again, this is coming primarily from Black feminists, bringing this to our attention. But how does disability cut here? How does class cut in here? And so one of the skills that I attempt to work on in our classes is how do you put on those intersectional glasses so you can bring that lens to bear. And if anybody's interested in particular on that issue of adultification of little Black girls, there's a really interesting study online called Girlhood Interrupted, the Erasure of Black Girls' Childhood. And it's, we'll have that link in the.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think the topic of intersectionality is a very important one. And as you were talking, Beth, I was thinking of a couple of things. One is that, when you look at the Black Lives Matter movement around Black men being killed, then there is this whole new tag, if you're on social media, say her name, because we don't want to forget the women as well. And the circumstances are all horrible. When you think of, I always tell people myself, if I use myself as an example, that I have many stories to tell. You just see one person on the screen right now, and you probably have a lot of assumptions and biases going through your head as you hear and see me. But I have multiple stories and multiple, I guess, characteristics that intersect, that make me who I am. So that is really an important one. And the other thing that I thought about when you mentioned disability is I saw a story of a young Black man who had disability, who was stopped by the police, and who couldn't communicate in the right way. And so there's all these issues are important. So thank you for bringing that out. Before turning to Jacinta, I want to turn to the chat room real quick. First, to give some shout out to the people who are joining us: Atlanta, San Francisco, Orlando, the mayor of Decatur, in Decatur, a lot of people from Decatur, DC. Welcome. I want to see Manhattan, New York, New Jersey. Wonderful. Glad to have all of you here. I'm trying to get through the bottom of the list to what your fears were, see if I can read some of them, but there was so many check-in, it's taken me a minute, so I can come back to that after Jacinta, just to save us time. But I want to ask you, Jacinta, we've had racist incident in Decatur involving high school students. Based on your work at the Atlanta International School, can you share some thoughts about what educators of children and parents can do?
Yes, of course, great question. I think the first step is to actually learn more and take initiative to do that. So learn about some of the concepts that Beth just shared about intersectionality and adultification. Purposely read books by Black scholars who have a lived experience with systemic racism: Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Ta-Nehisi Coates. Like, read those books, learn more, because the more that you learn as an adult, the better you'll be able to hold space for kids to have these conversations in ways that create safety and bravery at the same time. I think the second thing for me is we have to be explicit about where we stand as a community, and as parents about where you stand as a family. Don't leave that to interpretation. Many times that's an implicit thing. We value inclusion, but what's explicit about that? In our community, we do not accept racial epithets or racial slurs. We do not say these words, they are banned. And having those real conversations with kids and naming where you are and where you stand is critically important. I think for kids, they need to see us be a model. We are all operating in this racialized system. As adults, we all see and hear language or see behaviors that perpetuate racial bias in our classrooms, maybe on the playground, maybe in our worship centers or our soccer leagues or wherever they may be. And do we speak up, right? Do we model the behavior we want our students to see? Am I interrupting biased comments that happen in my classroom? Am I interrupting biased comments that my child might be saying, whether they're 3 years old or 18 years old? And being a model for that and doing it every single time. Because the one time that you don't, consistency is important, and the one time that we don't speak up, it sends a message that this is okay. And that's not a message that any of us can afford to send if we're seeking change. A lot of the work that we do as well is some front-end education for our students. For educators and for parents, Teaching Tolerance has a great educational framework for kids from kindergarten through 12th grade. It's an anti-bias framework, and it focuses on 4 key components. The first is identity, being comfortable and proud with who you are; diversity, understanding and appreciating who other people are and all of their differences; justice, recognizing unfairness and the impact of unfairness; and then finally action, taking a stand and advocating for your protection and also for the protection of others. And there's a really great framework that you can use that provides age-appropriate conversations and prompts that help you do that. So at AIS, some of the things that we've done is some things that started way before I got to AIS. For example, our counselors do a specific race education program with all of our kids from K through 12, and they do an amazing job with our race education and giving kids the language that they need and the content that they need to engage successfully in dialogues about race and racism. In our 3K through 2nd grade program, that looks like reading a book that talks about melanin and how do we get the color of our skin and where does it come from. And it's based on where our ancestors lived a long time ago, but now kids are using the words, so they're knowing that race, we're starting to teach race as a social construction. Your skin comes from where your ancestors lived a long time ago, it can get darker in the sun, etc. So having those conversations at age appropriate levels is really important. One of the other things that we try to do is get beneath the iceberg. So I talked about this in one of the responses to the questions, like we hear racial slurs or we see videos that kids post, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. But when you get below the iceberg in your community, where might microaggressions be taking place with students? And how do we find that information out? How do we get our students in a room to have that conversation and provide the space and give them the education that they need for the things that are below the iceberg? Because it's not just the slur, it's not just the video, it's things that our kids of color and our Black students experience every single day, day in and day out when they come to school or when they're interacting with their peers outside of school. And we have to get beneath that and solve for that and really talk about the things that are not as visible to us as they are to our kids of color and our Black students, and getting them in the room to be able to do that. And the next thing I think is skill development, right? We talk about, we want students to speak up. So when you see a classmate doing something that they should not be doing or saying something that's racially biased that they should not be saying, are you a bystander? What do? And I think it's important that we teach kids how to speak up. And again, one of my favorite resources is Teaching Tolerance. They do have a Speak Up at School manual, and it teaches kids 4 strategies to speak up that's age appropriate. And those strategies are interrupting, educating, questioning, and echoing when other people speak up, because there's power in one voice, but there's more power in more voices. And really driving this point home to our students that what we remember the most is not the words of our enemy, but it's really the silence of our friends and the silence of the people who think that they are good, but they're not speaking up. And what does that look like? So I think all of those strategies on the proactive side are important. And then on the reactive side, just because you're a community that values inclusion, values everyone feeling seen, heard, treated fairly, and protected, it does not mean you are exempt from biased behavior and bias incidents. At AIS, we value inclusion, we celebrate diversity and differences, and we're a community who that's really our foundation. However, that does not mean we are exempt or excluded from these behaviors, because we do exist in a broader society and social construct. But what it does mean is that when they do happen, we address it immediately. We investigate and we denounce the behavior. And we do that with families, we do that with kids, and we do that as often as possible when biased incidents do happen. And we try to repair the harm that's been done in our community. And I think we don't think about that enough. We focus on the consequence of the offender or the person who perpetuated the bias, and we ignore the harm and the emotional trauma that students might experience because of that incident, and being really intentional about repairing the harm and restoring community so we can move forward.
Thank you. So you answer or you address a lot of some of the issues in the chat room. There's also a lot of people wanting to partner. Yes, we are ready to partner to provide more. This is just a talk, but we also do training at Agnes Scott, the diversity office, so we're happy to do that as well. People talked about the difficulties of talking about racism, and I think the resources that both Beth and Jacinta provide are going to be amazing resources to you. Teachingtolerance.org that Jacinta just referred is also a good resource. So yeah, this is just one conversation. I want to say that this is on hour, just 1 hour we are talking about this. There are so many other ways for us to partner to really change our community. And I really look forward to that. So with that in mind, I want to ask both our panelists, what does racial justice mean to you? So we've done it all, we've got this right. What would it look like?
That is a great question. It's something that I actually think about a lot. And it's something that we haven't seen before, right? This is something new. It's different. And for me, when I think back to the components of structural racism, for me, racial justice is the proactive reinforcement of policies and practices, actions and attitudes that actually produce equitable access, produce equitable opportunities, treatment, outcomes and impacts across all races. And I think that's going to require reconciliation. One of the things that the United States has not done well is reconcile its past. And until we are ready to have that conversation, achieving racial justice is going to be difficult. I think it's going to require healing on multiple levels and rethinking the systems and the structures. I hear a lot of people, I saw a lot of signs out at the protest that says, fix the system. And the system's not broken, the system is doing what it is designed to do. So we need to break the system. And the question is, how do we break the system so that there are equitable outcomes across races? And I think it's gonna take creativity. We don't know what it looks like because we haven't seen it before. We can imagine it theoretically, but practically it's going to take collaboration. And I think what's most important is going to take centering the voices of Black people, centering the voices of communities of color in the solutions. Because Black folks and brown folks experience this every single day. And if their voices are not centered in the dialogue, and there's not space created for those voices to be heard and valued, we're going to end up in the same place. So a proactive reinforcement, equitable outcomes, centering the voices of the people who are most impacted by systemic racism is going to be key to achieving racial justice.
Beth, just before you answer, I want to put a plug right here for a new project we started at Agnes Scott. We have just been designated as a Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation Center by the AACU, and we are one of 24 campuses around the country who have this. And this is designed to do this work you just talked about, Jacinta, partnering with the communities to really start in the racial healing process and transform into, having racial justice be a reality. So Beth, back to you now. What does racial justice mean to you?
I want to echo Jacinta's thoughts on this, pretty much right down the line, and I guess the only thing. So right. I mean, I'm saying the same thing. I think in different words, but something like equal opportunity and treatment plus compensation for what has come before. And I guess, and one of the things I wanted to add though is that I read a really interesting little op-ed column in the New York Times by Charles Blows recently called "Allies Don't Fail Us Now." Mm-hmm. And the point that he was making is that what appears to have happened in the civil rights movement is that a lot of white people were horrified by the brutality that was being shown to them on their television screens. And they were motivated to, try to do something about that. But then the move to actual equality, because there's a big difference between saying stop the brutality and no, racial justice, which is a much bigger lift and has an impact, a profound impact on white people's lives too, in terms of what we're going to have to give up, frankly, that power that we're going to have to give up. So that's the only thing I would add is it's not just stopping racial brutality. We're talking about equality of opportunity and treatment and compensation as well.
Thank you. So centering Black voices and allies do not fail us. I love those two. So I'm going to do a poll just to check with our audiences really quick, especially on this idea of being an ally. And it's going to be, remember the polls are anonymous. Being an ally is about doing and not just knowing. Don't fail us now, as Beth just said. So given the urgency of doing something now, realistically, how many anti-racist action can, I have now 336 people listening, can you commit to doing right now during the month of June? We have a list for you. It can be any one of those. We just want to know what's the next. We don't want this to be just a conversation where we stop and nothing's happened. We want to help you commit yourself to doing something amazing. So here, the poll's up, I think, right? Yes. So we want to hear your answer. And we realize there might be some you disagree with or you can't do. We understand that. We try to create a list where everybody can find something that they can do. So I want to take the polls and see what can you do. And I also want to say at this time that there is a list. So if you go on the Agnes Scott College website, you type diversity in the search box, it will take you to our website. There is a list of tons of things you can do. We have resources from all over that we've been compiling. So these are just some idea. I do want to put a plug in for the number 8, I believe it is, the take an online anti-racism training. There is a free one at the Institute of El Paso has put online. It's also on our webpage. So there's a lot of free online resources. We are going to step the poll now. Thank you, and I hope you all saw the results. And you all remember individually what you said you were going to do. Hold yourself accountable for that. Don't just let it go because this is past. So we are about to wrap up. At the beginning of this webinar, we talked about how many white parents have never learned how to talk about race and racism with their kids. We know that silence perpetuates racism. So we just talked about the list of resources that is on our website, ways to partner with us, with Agnes Scott College. We are happy to support. Now I want to give our panelists a chance for their final thoughts. Before we talked about the rest of our series, the episode 2, 3, 4. So let's start with you, Jacinta.
Yeah, so I think we all have work to do, determining what is your work and doing your work. If you haven't noticed, I'm a big quote person. So Arthur Ashe says, start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. I think we need to stop making excuses around, I don't know how to do this. There are lots of resources, try it, you will fail. Be a goodish person. You will have to try again, and you'll have to keep trying again. It's no longer okay where we are, and it's not been to stand in solidarity. What we need is for folks to act in solidarity. So my question that I want to leave people with is, what is your work? And what does that mean for you, your institutions that you're a part of, the sphere of influence that you do have, and do that work, and then do something else, and then do something else. But what's important is that we keep growing and we keep going.
Beth?
I think I have 3 things. So the first one is actually something is to get educated. If I'm talking in particular to my white colleagues here, get educated and educate other white people. We're extraordinarily fortunate to have Karis at Agnes Scott in our community, and they're doing amazing work and have really amazing book lists. I noticed in the chat that a lot of people seem to be saying that they were worried about not having enough knowledge, though, to move to act now. And I guess what I want to suggest is that we know a lot about being white, And that's something that we need to think about and reflect on and bring to the table as well. The idea here is not to just like, oh, I want to figure out how to help people of color. Like, that's not the model, right? The model is that this is about justice work, and we are positioned in a certain way as white people, and we have knowledge as white people that we need to bring to the table. So that's one thing. Second thing, just echoing a lot of what Jacinta was saying, it's about taking action. So following people of color's lead and supporting their work without expecting them to educate or praise us for doing it. And joining with others to make change where we have power. So, you know, we mentioned that white people in general are not educated about the racial history and realities of our world. So, okay, school boards and curriculum, that's something that often white people are in a position to influence, and parents can influence. Doing our homework about sheriffs and judges and prosecutors before we vote. A lot of us just skip those on the ballot. So these are concrete things that we can do very quickly. And then the third thing I think is, and this is about how we can talk to each other and talk, you know, and do this for ourselves, recognizing that shame is not productive. I think often when white people first start to come to grips with being white, what we feel is a lot of shame. And so I would hope that we're motivated by a desire for justice. And when we engage with other whites, we want to do it in a way that doesn't shame them and shut them down, but invites them into the conversation. So a quotation that I really like is more curiosity, less judgment.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. I want to say there's so much more we could talk about, but as always, there's just a lot. There's a lot in the chat room that we didn't get to, but I promise people, if you send us an email, you need a resource, we will provide it to you. We will help you find a resource at least. And I can always forward questions to our panelists that you felt you needed answered that we did not. So I want to say that and acknowledge that. I really want to thank both of you for your time this afternoon. It was an amazing discussion. I want to remind our listeners and viewers that next week will be episode 2 of our series. I don't know what else to call them, but episode. I'll come up with a better word one of these days. But it will feature a panel of city leaders who will talk about the city of Decatur, about what they are doing right now these days to address issues in the city. It will be a very courageous conversations, and we thank them in advance for coming forward. And so we will send out the link and you can register.